On a crisp autumn morning in the quiet suburb of Pine Valley, Officer James Chen was doing his routine patrol when something caught his trained eye. After 15 years on the force, he had developed what his colleagues called a sixth sense for trouble, and today that sense was screaming at him. An elderly woman was walking unsteadily along Cedar Street, her movements slow and hesitant. She was wearing a cream-colored cardigan and beige trousers, but what made Officer Chen's heart skip a beat were the dark red stains on her pants. At first glance, they might have been wine or paint, but his experience told him otherwise. He pulled his patrol car to the curb, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. The last thing he wanted was to startle her. The woman, who he would later learn was Mrs. Wilson, appeared to be in her early 70s, with silver hair neatly pinned back and pearl earrings that spoke of a lifetime of careful grooming. "Good morning, ma'am," he called out softly, stepping out of his car. "I'm Officer Chen. Would you mind if I walked with you for a moment?" Mrs. Wilson turned toward him with a vague smile, her eyes seeming to look through him rather than at him. "Oh, hello, dear. Are you here about the cats? They need their breakfast, you know. They get so hungry this time of day." Something in her voice made Officer Chen's skin prickle. He'd worked with elderly residents before and recognized the signs of confusion, but there was something else here, something that made his police instincts kick into high alert. "Let me help you with those cats," he offered, falling into step beside her. He noticed her hands were trembling slightly, and there were scratch marks on her forearms. Fresh ones. As they walked, he tried to engage her in conversation, using the gentle tone he perfected over years of community policing. "Have you lived in the neighborhood long, ma'am?" "Oh yes, forever and ever," she replied, her voice drifting like leaves in the wind. "Since Tommy was just a boy. He used to climb that tree right there." She pointed to a massive oak, her hand shaking. "But he's not allowed to climb anymore, not since the accident." Officer Chen made a mental note. Was Tommy her son? A grandson? And what accident was she referring to? He kept his questions light, non-threatening, as they approached a well-maintained two-story house with flower boxes in the windows. The garden was immaculate, with late-blooming roses and carefully trimmed hedges. Everything about the property spoke of years of loving care, except for the morning newspaper still lying in the driveway, something that seemed out of character for such a meticulously kept home. Mrs. Wilson fumbled with her house keys at the front door, dropping them twice before Officer Chen gently offered to help. As he picked up the keys, he noticed more scratches on her hands and what looked like dried blood under her fingernails. His heart was pounding now, but years of training kept his voice steady. "Allow me, ma'am." He selected the right key and inserted it into the lock, all while keeping one hand near his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. The door swung open silently, revealing a darkened hallway. The house was eerily quiet. No TV sounds, no radio, no signs of normal morning activity. The air felt heavy, oppressive, carrying a scent that made Officer Chen's stomach clench. After 15 years on the force, he knew that smell all too well. "The cats are in the kitchen," Mrs. Wilson said cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "They like their breakfast at exactly 8 o'clock, you know. They're very particular about that." Officer Chen took a careful step inside, his hand instinctively moving to his flashlight. The hallway was lined with family photos, happy moments frozen in time. He saw Mrs. Wilson through the years, at a wedding, holding a baby, at what looked like a graduation ceremony. In every photo, she was smiling, vibrant, present in a way she wasn't now. The hardwood floor creaked under his feet as he moved forward, following Mrs. Wilson, who was shuffling toward the kitchen at the end of the hall. His flashlight beam revealed something that made his blood run cold, a trail of dark footprints leading from the kitchen to the front door. He reached for his radio, keeping his voice low and calm. "Dispatch, this is Officer Chen. I'm going to need backup at 1247 Cedar Street. Possible." He paused, looking at Mrs. Wilson, who was now humming softly to herself. "Possible situation requiring medical assistance. Please respond." The radio crackled with acknowledgement as he approached the kitchen doorway. Mrs. Wilson had already disappeared inside, still humming that tuneless melody. The sound echoed through the house, mixing with the sudden frantic beating of his heart. Officer Chen took a deep breath, steadying himself. In moments like these, preparation met instinct, and both were telling him the same thing. Whatever waited in that kitchen would change lives forever. He tightened his grip on his flashlight, took one more steadying breath, and stepped forward. The kitchen doorway loomed before him, a threshold between the normal world and whatever lay beyond. As he reached for the light switch, Mrs. Wilson's voice drifted out, still cheerful, still disconnected from reality. "Now, where did I put that cat food? The cats must be so hungry by now." Officer Chen's finger found the switch, and as fluorescent light flooded the kitchen, time seemed to stop. His body froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. In his 15 years on the force, he had seen many things, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across a scene that would haunt Officer Chen's dreams for years to come. In that moment of frozen time, standing in the doorway of what should have been a normal suburban kitchen, he realized that this quiet autumn morning had just become the beginning of a much darker story. He reached for his radio again, this time with a slightly trembling hand. "Dispatch," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "send everyone. And hurry." Behind him, Mrs. Wilson was still humming, lost in her own world, while the morning sun continued to rise over Pine Valley, unaware that it was illuminating the beginning of a tragedy that would shake the entire community to its core. Officer Chen's heart was racing as he watched Mrs. Wilson move through her kitchen, seemingly blind to the horror around her. She opened cabinets with trembling hands, muttering about cat food while stepping through evidence that told a very different story than the one she was living in. "Mrs. Wilson," he said softly, using the name he'd spotted on one of the family photos in the hallway. "Why don't we sit down for a moment?" He gestured toward the living room, trying to guide her away from the kitchen. "But the cats," she protested, her voice quivering. "They need their breakfast. They get so cross when they're hungry." Her hands kept moving, opening and closing drawers, her movements becoming more agitated with each passing moment. Officer Chen could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. He needed to keep her calm until backup arrived. Drawing from years of experience with elderly residents, he tried a different approach. "The cats have been fed," he said gently. "Remember? We can check on them later. Right now, I'd love to hear about those roses in your garden. They're beautiful." For a moment, clarity seemed to flash in Mrs. Wilson's eyes. "The roses? Oh yes, my husband planted those when we first moved in. He says yellow roses mean friendship, you know." Her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before, but then confusion clouded her features again. "He should be up by now. He always makes coffee in the morning." The sirens were very close now. Officer Chen could see the flashing lights through the kitchen window, casting red and blue shadows across the room. He needed to get Mrs. Wilson out of the house before the other officers came in. "Let's go sit on the porch," he suggested. "The morning air is so nice, and we can watch your roses while we talk." But Mrs. Wilson's attention had shifted again. She was staring at her hands now, really seeing them perhaps for the first time that morning. Something's not right," she whispered. Her voice had changed, becoming small and frightened. "My hands. Why are my hands?" The front door opened, and Officer Chen heard the familiar sound of his colleagues entering the house. He needed to act quickly before the situation spiraled out of control. "Mrs. Wilson," he said firmly but kindly, "some of my friends are here to help us. Would you mind if they took a look around while we sit outside?" She looked up at him, and for a brief moment her eyes cleared completely. In that instant, she seemed to take in everything: the blood on her clothes, the state of the kitchen, the police officers now gathering in her hallway. Her face crumpled. "Something's happened, hasn't it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Something terrible." Before Officer Chen could respond, she began to shake uncontrollably. He moved quickly, catching her just as her legs gave way. Other officers rushed forward to help, and together they guided her to a chair in the living room. The paramedics arrived moments later, their practiced movements bringing a sense of order to the chaos. They spoke to Mrs. Wilson in soft, professional tones while checking her vital signs. She seemed to have retreated into herself again, responding to their questions with distant, disconnected answers about cats and roses. Detective Lisa Park arrived next, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of the scene. She pulled Officer Chen aside while the paramedics continued their work. "What can you tell me?" she asked quietly. Officer Chen described everything. The blood-stained trousers, the confused conversation, the scratch marks on Mrs. Wilson's arms. As he spoke, other officers were carefully documenting the scene, their cameras flashing as they preserved evidence that would be crucial in understanding what had happened in this peaceful suburban home. Outside, neighbors were beginning to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of police cars and an ambulance on their quiet street. They spoke in hushed whispers, sharing what they knew about the elderly couple who had lived in the house for decades. "They were always so kind," one neighbor told Detective Park. "Mrs. Wilson used to bake cookies for all the neighborhood children. And her husband, he helped everyone with their gardens. They were like grandparents to all of us." As the morning wore on, more details emerged. A nephew was contacted. Medical records were obtained. The picture they painted was heartbreaking. A loving couple facing the cruel reality of aging. Mrs. Wilson had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months earlier, but they had been trying to manage on their own, too proud, or perhaps too scared to ask for help. The paramedics were ready to transport Mrs. Wilson to the hospital. As they helped her onto the stretcher, she grabbed Officer Chen's hand. "The cats," she said urgently. "Please don't forget to feed the cats." He held her hand gently. "Don't worry, Mrs. Wilson. We'll take care of everything." But there were no cats in the house. There hadn't been for years, according to the neighbors. The cat food she had been so worried about existed only in her confused mind. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens silent now, Officer Chen stood on the front porch, looking at those carefully tended yellow roses. They swayed gently in the morning breeze, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded behind the walls of the house they adorned. Detective Park joined him, her notebook in hand. "The kitchen's been processed," she said quietly. "We're ready for the next phase." Officer Chen nodded, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long and painful investigation, but his thoughts kept returning to Mrs. Wilson's moments of clarity, to the terror and confusion in her eyes when reality briefly broke through the fog of her condition. The morning sun was high now, warming the autumn air. More neighbors had gathered, forming small groups on the sidewalk, sharing stories about the couple who had been fixtures in their community for so long. Their voices carried notes of shock, sadness, and the unspoken question that would haunt this neighborhood for months to come. How had no one noticed? How had things gone so wrong? As crime scene technicians continued their methodical work inside the house, Officer Chen couldn't help but think about all the quiet tragedies that might be unfolding behind other peaceful facades, about all the elderly couples struggling alone with the weight of aging and illness. A gentle breeze carried the scent of Mrs. Wilson's roses across the porch, a sweet counterpoint to the grim reality inside. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed, marking another hour in a day that had forever changed the lives of everyone involved. The autumn morning had grown warmer, but inside the Wilson house, the air remained cold and heavy. Officer Chen stood at the kitchen entrance, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Even with backup arriving, he knew these next few moments would stay with him forever. The kitchen was a study in contrasts. Cheerful yellow curtains fluttered at the window, and a row of decorative plates lined the walls, each one showing peaceful country scenes. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the counter next to a cold cup of coffee. Everything looked so normal, except for what shouldn't have been there. Detective Park stepped up beside him, her face grim. "The forensics team is 5 minutes out," she said quietly. "What made you stop to check on her this morning?" Officer Chen kept his voice low, conscious of the other officers moving through the house. "Something in her eyes," he replied. "That distant look and the bloodstains. But I never expected." His voice trailed off as his flashlight beam caught something metallic near the refrigerator. The kitchen floor told a story neither of them wanted to read. Scattered across the linoleum were ordinary objects turned extraordinary by circumstance. A broken coffee mug, its pieces spread like stars across the floor. A dish towel with bright flowers printed on it, now stained dark. A pair of reading glasses, one lens cracked. "Look at the wall calendar," Detective Park pointed. It was turned to the wrong month, and dates were crossed out randomly, some multiple times. Signs were there. Little things that probably seemed harmless at first. A young officer stepped into the kitchen and immediately stepped back, his face pale. Detective Park sent him to secure the perimeter instead. Not everyone was ready for scenes like this, no matter how much training they had. The forensics team arrived, their equipment cases making soft thuds against the hardwood floors. They moved with practiced efficiency, photographing everything before they touched it, placing numbered markers next to items of interest. Officer Chen watched them work, his mind trying to piece together what had happened. The morning paper in the driveway, the cold coffee cup, the reading glasses on the floor. An ordinary morning that had somehow turned into anything but. Found something, called one of the forensics team members. She was kneeling by the sink, examining the cabinet underneath. Looks like someone tried to clean up. She carefully swabbed the inside of the cabinet door, where faint smudges were visible. Detective Park studied the kitchen table, where a plate of half-eaten toast sat next to a bottle of pills. She picked up the bottle carefully with a gloved hand. Prescription medication, she said, dated 2 weeks ago, still almost full. The implications hung heavy in the air. Had Mrs. Wilson stopped taking her medication? Had someone been supposed to help her remember? The questions multiplied with each new detail they uncovered. Outside, they could hear the neighbors talking in hushed voices. Word was spreading through the quiet community. Officer Chen knew that by nightfall, everyone would have their own version of events, their own theories about what had gone wrong. A phone rang somewhere in the house, startling them all. Detective Park nodded to an officer to answer it. They could hear his quiet voice explaining to whoever was calling that there had been an incident, that more information would be available later. The morning sun had finally reached the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the floor. The forensics team worked in these shifting patterns of light and dark, their cameras flashing as they documented everything. "Check this," called one of them, pointing to the refrigerator door. Magnetic letters spelled out "Feids" in shaky handwriting. Below that, another set of letters read "Coffee for Joanne," presumably Mr. Wilson's morning reminder. Officer Chen remembered Mrs. Wilson's constant worry about feeding cats that didn't exist. Had that message been there for days, weeks? How long had the lines between reality and confusion been blurring for her? Detective Park was in the adjoining laundry room now, examining the washing machine. "It's been running," she called out. "Recently." She carefully opened the lid, revealing clothes mid-cycle, the water tinged pink. The forensics team leader approached Officer Chen. "We're ready for the next phase," she said quietly. "The medical examiner is here." Through the kitchen window, Officer Chen could see more vehicles arriving, the medical examiner's van, additional police units, a car that probably belonged to someone from the district attorney's office. The quiet neighborhood was becoming a hub of official activity. A gentle chime sounded through the house, a grandfather clock in the living room striking the hour. The sound seemed to come from another world, one where this was still just a normal house on a normal morning. Detective Park joined Officer Chen near the kitchen door. "We'll need your full statement," she said, "but take a minute if you need it. First one's on scene, it's never easy." He nodded, grateful for her understanding. His eyes swept the kitchen one last time, taking in details he knew would appear in his dreams. The cheerful curtains, the crossed-out calendar, the magnetic letters on the refrigerator door. Outside, fall leaves skidded across the driveway where the morning paper still lay untouched. A neighbor had brought coffee for the officers, and the smell drifted in through the open front door. A cruel reminder of the ordinary morning this should have been. One of the forensics team members called Detective Park over to look at something they'd found behind the refrigerator. Officer Chen stayed where he was, his mind going back to Mrs. Wilson's face when clarity had briefly returned, that moment of horror when reality broke through. He thought about the years of happy photos in the hallway, the carefully tended roses in the garden, the decades of love and life that had filled this house. How quietly tragedy could creep in, disguised as forgetfulness, confused conversations, crossed-out calendar dates. The medical examiner's team was entering now, bringing with them a different kind of quiet. Officer Chen stepped aside to let them pass, knowing that soon this kitchen would give up the rest of its secrets, telling a story that nobody in this peaceful neighborhood had seen coming. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Wilson's yellow roses swaying in the autumn breeze, their bright faces turned toward the sun, unaware that everything had changed. The morning wasn't over yet, but already it felt like a lifetime had passed since he'd first noticed those bloodstains on a confused elderly woman's trousers. The medical examiner's team worked with quiet efficiency in the Wilsons' kitchen, their movements careful and precise. What they found near the refrigerator told a story that broke everyone's heart. Mr. Wilson had apparently been preparing his morning coffee when whatever happened. Detective Park stood in the doorway, taking notes as the team worked. "Time of death appears to be early morning," the medical examiner said softly. The coffee maker was still warm when the first officers arrived. Officer Chen watched from the living room, where he was working on his initial report. The details were important. Every small observation could help piece together the tragedy that had unfolded in this quiet home. He noted how the morning newspaper was still in the driveway, breaking what neighbors said was Mr. Wilson's decades-long routine of reading it over breakfast. The kitchen, once a place of warm family gatherings, had become a crime scene. Evidence markers dotted the floor, each one representing a piece of the puzzle. The medical examiner pointed out signs that suggested confusion rather than malice, erratic movements, defensive wounds that indicated panic rather than intent. "Look at this," Detective Park called, pointing to a small notebook by the phone. Inside, in steady handwriting that must have been Mr. Wilson's, was a list of reminders. Take pills with breakfast. Check if she's taken hers. Call the doctor about new symptoms. Don't forget, appointment next Tuesday. The last entry was particularly heart-wrenching. Remember, she gets confused sometimes. Be patient. She's still in there. Outside, autumn leaves rustled across the front lawn as more officials arrived. His social worker was speaking with neighbors, gathering information about the couple's recent behavior. The stories painted a picture of gradual decline that everyone had noticed, but nobody had fully understood. "They were always so independent," one elderly neighbor explained, her voice trembling. Mr. Wilson said they were managing just fine. He didn't want to burden anyone. Inside the kitchen, the forensics team was photographing a series of sticky notes on the cupboard doors. Each one labeled the contents inside: plates, cups, medicine, written in Mr. Wilson's careful hand. He had been trying to help his wife navigate their changing world. Detective Park picked up a photo that had fallen under the kitchen table. It showed the couple in happier times, probably just a few years ago, standing in their garden among the yellow roses. They were smiling, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking vibrant and present. The medical examiner finished his preliminary examination and stood up slowly. "It appears he was trying to help her," he said quietly to Detective Park. "There are defensive wounds on his hands, suggesting he was attempting to calm her rather than protect himself." This detail hit Officer Chen hard. Even in those final moments, Mr. Wilson had been thinking of his wife's welfare rather than his own safety. It was both beautiful and devastating. The kitchen clock continued its steady ticking, marking time in a house where time had become increasingly meaningless to at least one of its residents. The morning sun now streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, oblivious to the gravity of the scene below. A detective from the Elder Abuse Unit arrived, though this case didn't fit the usual pattern. "Sometimes the biggest danger to our elderly citizens is isolation," she explained to Officer Chen. "Pride keeps them from asking for help, and everyone assumes someone else is checking on them." The evidence collection continued methodically. Each item was photographed, logged, and carefully bagged: the coffee cup, the morning mail that had never been opened, the pills that hadn't been taken. Together, they told a story of a loving couple overwhelmed by the cruel progression of illness. Through the kitchen window, officers could see more neighbors gathering, sharing stories about the Wilsons. How Mr. Wilson had helped everyone with their gardens. How Mrs. Wilson used to bake pies for new families moving into the neighborhood. How they'd been fixtures at community events until recently. Detective Park was examining the refrigerator now, noting the array of magnets holding up appointment reminders, phone numbers for doctors, and emergency contacts. "He was trying so hard to keep their world organized," she said softly. "Look at how everything is labeled and scheduled." The social worker returned with more background information. Mrs. Wilson's doctor had been encouraging them to consider assisted living, but Mr. Wilson had insisted they could manage. He'd developed systems: the sticky notes, the reminders, the careful scheduling of each day. As the morning wore on, the kitchen gradually yielded its secrets. Each piece of evidence they collected helped form a clearer picture of what had happened, not a story of violence, but one of love, desperation, and the terrible toll of aging without adequate support. Officer Chen finished his report, his handwriting unusually careful as he documented every detail. He knew this case would stay with him, not because of its violence, but because of its profound sadness. How many other elderly couples were out there, he wondered, trying to cope alone with the challenges of aging and illness? The medical examiner's team prepared to remove Mr. Wilson's body. They worked with quiet respect, conscious of the neighbors watching from behind the police tape. In death as in life, he would be treated with the dignity he deserved. Through it all, the yellow roses continued to bloom in the garden, their bright faces a poignant reminder of happier days. The morning was advancing toward noon, but in the Wilson house, time seemed to stand still, frozen in that moment when a routine morning had turned into something else entirely. Detective Park made one final sweep of the kitchen, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. Tomorrow, there would be reports to file, questions to answer, decisions to make. But for now, they all stood in silent witness to a tragedy born not of hatred or anger, but of love that had persisted even as understanding faded. As the autumn sun climbed higher in the sky, the investigation at the Wilson house shifted into its next phase. Detective Park sat in the living room with a team of investigators, piecing together the events that had led to this tragic morning. Medical records spread across the coffee table told a story that was becoming all too familiar. Mrs. Wilson's diagnosis of early-stage dementia had come 6 months earlier, but the signs had been there long before. Missed appointments, confusion over dates, repeating stories, all noted by her doctor with increasing concern. "The nephew's here," Officer Chen said quietly from the doorway. He'd been waiting for the family to arrive, knowing how difficult these conversations would be. The man who stepped into the living room looked shell-shocked, his face pale beneath graying hair. "I should have checked on them more often," the nephew said, sinking into an armchair. Uncle insisted they were managing fine. He was always so independent, so proud. He said they had a system worked out. Detective Park listened as the nephew shared details about the couple's recent history. How his uncle had gradually taken over all the household tasks. How he'd created elaborate routines to help his aunt stay oriented. How he'd refused offers of help, saying they were adjusting just fine. Outside, forensics teams were still working, documenting every detail of the house. The kitchen calendar revealed a pattern of confusion, appointments written multiple times, days crossed out randomly, notes that made sense only to their writer. The social worker who'd been interviewing neighbors joined them, her notebook full of observations. The community noticed changes, she explained. Mrs. Wilson stopped attending her garden club meetings. Mr. Wilson seemed more tired, more worried. But everyone respected their privacy. More family members arrived throughout the morning, distant cousins, a niece from 3 states away. Each brought pieces of the puzzle, sharing stories of phone calls that had grown increasingly concerning, of offers of help that had been gently but firmly declined. Detective Park's team had found a journal in Mr. Wilson's desk drawer. The entries tracked his wife's decline with heartbreaking clarity. "She was confused again today," one entry read. "Spent hours looking for our old cat, the one we lost 5 years ago. I didn't have the heart to remind her." The medical examiner's preliminary report arrived, confirming what they had suspected. The tragedy had unfolded in moments of confusion, with no real intent behind it. Mrs. Wilson had likely experienced a severe episode of disorientation, and her husband's attempts to calm her had somehow escalated the situation. In the kitchen, evidence markers still dotted the floor, each one representing a moment in the timeline they were reconstructing. The coffee maker, the morning paper, the reading glasses, ordinary objects that had witnessed an extraordinary tragedy. The nephew picked up a framed photo from the mantel showing the couple at their 50th wedding anniversary celebration just 2 years ago. "They were so happy that day," he said softly. Aunt was still mostly herself then. Uncle said the bad days were just beginning. Detective Park reviewed the notes from Mrs. Wilson's doctor. There had been recommendations for in-home care, for safety evaluations, for support services. All gently declined by a couple determined to maintain their independence. The social worker shared what she'd learned from the neighbors. Small signs that now seemed significant. Mrs. Wilson wandering in the garden at odd hours, Mr. Wilson looking increasingly exhausted, the gradual withdrawal from community activities. "It's a pattern we see too often," the elder care specialist explained. "Couples who've been together for decades try to handle everything themselves. The healthy spouse becomes the caregiver, often at great personal cost. Officer Chen, still working on his report, thought about his own grandparents, wondering if they might need checking on more often. This case had touched something deep in everyone involved, reminding them of their own aging relatives, their own uncertain futures. The investigation continued methodically. Phone records showed calls to doctors, to family members, to support services. Mr. Wilson had been reaching out, but always stopping short of asking for the help they really needed. Late in the afternoon, news arrived from the hospital where Mrs. Wilson had been taken. She remained confused, asking repeatedly about her cats and her garden. The doctors were evaluating her condition, trying to determine the best course of action. The nephew made calls to extended family, explaining what had happened in quiet, pained conversations. Each call ended with the same question: could we have done more? Detective Park gathered her team for a final briefing. The evidence was clear. This was a tragedy born of illness and isolation, not of malice. The real question was how to prevent it from happening to other couples facing similar challenges. The social worker was already compiling resources, information about support services, about assisted living options, about ways communities could better look after their elderly neighbors. This case would become a catalyst for change, though the cost had been terribly high. As the day drew to a close, the Wilson house slowly emptied of investigators. The evidence had been collected, photographs taken, statements recorded. All that remained was the heavy silence of a home where everything had changed in the space of the morning. Officer Chen made one final walk through the house before it was sealed. In the kitchen, the morning's coffee still sat untouched, a last reminder of the ordinary day it should have been. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its steady ticking, marking time in a house where time had lost its meaning. Outside, the yellow roses caught the last rays of sunlight, their brightness a stark contrast to the day's events. The nephew stood looking at them, remembering how his aunt and uncle had tended them together for so many years. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, though everyone knew there were no easy answers. The investigation would continue, reports would be filed, decisions would be made about Mrs. Wilson's care. But the deeper questions, about aging, about independence, about how we cared for our elderly, would linger long after this case was closed. Detective Park took one last look at the house before leaving. Tomorrow, there would be more questions to answer, more details to analyze. But for now, the quiet neighborhood was left to absorb the day's events, each resident perhaps looking at their elderly neighbors with new awareness and concern. The psychiatric ward of Pine Valley Hospital was quiet in the early evening. Mrs. Wilson sat in a sunlit room, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she gazed out the window. The doctors had been observing her for hours, noting how she drifted between clarity and confusion like a boat untethered in gentle waves. Dr. Thompson, the lead psychiatrist, sat with Detective Park and Officer Chen, explaining their initial findings. "She has no clear memory of what happened this morning," she said gently. "When we try to discuss it, she either becomes extremely agitated or retreats into talking about her cats and garden." Through the observation window, they could see Mrs. Wilson arranging and rearranging the items on her bedside table, a family photo, a small vase of flowers her nephew had brought, a box of tissues. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if creating order in her small space could somehow restore order to her world. The combination of untaken medication and progressing dementia likely triggered an acute episode, Dr. Thompson explained. Her recent medical records show her condition was advancing more rapidly than initially predicted. The nephew arrived with a small suitcase of his aunt's clothes and personal items. He'd spent the afternoon going through the house, selecting comfortable, familiar things, her favorite sweater, well-worn slippers, the blanket she liked to have while reading. "How is she doing?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. The doctors shared what they knew, that Mrs. Wilson was physically stable but mentally fragile. The full impact of the morning's events hadn't yet registered in any lasting way. A neurologist joined them, bringing brain scan results that showed the progression of Mrs. Wilson's condition. The images told a story of gradual decline that had suddenly accelerated. The stress of trying to maintain independence likely contributed to the rapid deterioration, he explained. Inside her room, Mrs. Wilson was now talking softly to herself, straightening the edges of her blanket with trembling hands. Sometimes she would look up expectantly, as if waiting for someone to arrive. The staff knew she was waiting for her husband, though she couldn't quite remember why he hadn't come to visit. The hospital's elder care specialist met with the family to discuss options for the future. "She'll need specialized care now," she explained kindly. "There are excellent facilities that can provide the level of support and supervision she requires." The nephew leafed through brochures of care homes, each promising comfort and dignity for their residents. How strange it felt to be making these decisions, he thought, when just yesterday his aunt and uncle had been living independently in their own home. Dr. Thompson reviewed Mrs. Wilson's medication history with the team. Her husband had created an elaborate system to track their pills, she noted, but as her confusion increased, she often forgot to take them or took them irregularly. Outside the hospital, autumn leaves danced across the parking lot as evening approached. Officer Chen, finishing his final report, watched through the window as families came and went, carrying flowers, food, hopes for recovery. How many of them, he wondered, were also struggling with aging relatives, trying to balance independence with safety. The psychiatric evaluation continued throughout the evening. Different doctors asked gentle questions, observed reactions, noted responses. Mrs. Wilson cooperated as best she could, though she frequently became distracted, asking about her cats or whether someone had watered her roses. The most challenging aspect, Dr. Thompson explained to the family, is that she fluctuates between understanding and confusion. During lucid moments, she knows something terrible has happened, but her mind protects her by retreating into safer memories. The hospital social worker joined them, bringing information about support groups for families dealing with dementia. "You're not alone in this," she assured the nephew. "Many families face similar challenges. There's help available." As night fell, the hospital settled into its quiet routine. Mrs. Wilson had finally drifted off to sleep, her face peaceful for the first time since morning. The nurses had dimmed her lights but left the door slightly open, allowing them to check on her regularly. Detective Park made her final notes before leaving. The case would be handled with sensitivity, taking into account Mrs. Wilson's medical condition and the circumstances that had led to this tragedy. The focus now was on ensuring she received the care she needed. The nephew stayed late, watching his aunt sleep. He remembered summer afternoons in their garden, how she had taught him the names of all the roses, how his uncle had shown him how to prune them properly. Those memories seemed to belong to another lifetime now. Dr. Thompson prepared her preliminary report for the court. "The patient's condition makes her unfit to stand trial," she wrote. Her actions were the result of severe cognitive impairment, not criminal intent. The words felt inadequate to describe the complexity of the situation. The night staff took over, their quiet efficiency bringing comfort to the family. They understood dementia patients, knew how to handle confusion and distress with gentle reassurance. Mrs. Wilson would be well cared for here while decisions were made about her future. Before leaving, the nephew placed his aunt's favorite photo on her bedside table, one showing her and his uncle in their garden, surrounded by blooming roses. In the morning, he knew she might not remember why she was here, but perhaps the familiar faces would bring her some peace. The hospital corridors grew quiet as visiting hours ended. Mrs. Wilson slept on, her world now narrowed to this room, her reality shifting like sand between what was and what had been. Tomorrow would bring more evaluations, more decisions, more attempts to understand and help. Outside, the city settled into night, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Somewhere in a quiet suburb, a house stood empty, its garden of yellow roses waiting for hands that would never tend them again. Inside the hospital, teams of medical professionals prepared to help one more family navigate the difficult journey through aging, illness, and loss. 3 months after that fateful autumn morning, the Pine Valley community was still coming to terms with what had happened at the Wilson house. The yellow roses had withered with winter's arrival, but their presence remained a poignant reminder of the couple who had tended them for so many years. The tragedy had sparked important changes in the quiet suburb. Neighbors who once politely kept their distance now checked on each other regularly. The local community center had started a weekly support group for families caring for elderly relatives. Even the police department had implemented new training programs focused on recognizing signs of dementia and elderly distress. Officer Chen drove past the Wilson house on his regular patrol route, noting the property's careful maintenance. The nephew had hired a service to keep the garden tidy and the lawn mowed while decisions about the house's future were being made. Sometimes, early in the morning, he would see elderly residents walking past, pausing to look at the roses that would bloom again in spring. At Pine Valley Care Home, Mrs. Wilson had settled into a new routine. The specialist facility provided the structured environment and constant supervision she needed. Her room was decorated with familiar items from home, family photos, her favorite reading chair, the soft blanket she'd always kept on her couch. The staff had learned her patterns, understood how to handle her moments of confusion with gentle redirection. They knew that mornings were often her clearest times, when she could participate in activities and interact with other residents. They also knew that as evening approached, her confusion typically increased, and she would begin asking about her cats and garden. Detective Park had completed her final report, its conclusions leading to significant changes in how the community approached elderly care. Local authorities had established a new outreach program, actively connecting with elderly residents who lived alone or served as caregivers for spouses. The nephew visited his aunt regularly, bringing fresh flowers and updates about the neighborhood. During her lucid moments, Mrs. Wilson would ask about her roses, and he would share photos of the garden, promising that everything was being maintained just as she and his uncle had always kept it. The community's response to the tragedy had been remarkable. A local charity established the Wilson Memorial Fund, providing resources for elderly couples needing support services. Church groups organized volunteer programs to help seniors with household tasks and transportation to medical appointments. At the police station, Officer Chen had become an advocate for elderly welfare checks. His experience that autumn morning had shown him how quickly situations could deteriorate behind closed doors. He worked with social services to develop better protocols for identifying at-risk seniors. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about aging in place, featuring experts discussing the challenges faced by elderly couples trying to maintain independence. Each piece included resources and contact information for support services, making it easier for families to find help before crisis struck. Mrs. Wilson's story became a catalyst for change in other communities as well. Neighboring towns began implementing similar programs, recognizing that their own elderly residents might be struggling silently with similar challenges. At the care facility, the staff noticed small improvements in Mrs. Wilson's condition once she settled into a regular routine. Though her dementia continued to progress, the structured environment and consistent care helped reduce her confusion and anxiety. The nephew had finally begun the difficult task of sorting through his aunt and uncle's belongings. Each item held memories, photo albums documenting decades of family gatherings, garden tools worn smooth with use, handwritten recipes his aunt had collected over the years. The house itself stood as a testament to a life well lived, a home filled with love that had ultimately become overwhelmed by the challenges of aging and illness. Local real estate agents suggested selling, but the nephew couldn't bring himself to make that decision yet. In the hospital's psychiatric department, Dr. Thompson used the case as a teaching tool for medical residents, emphasizing the importance of recognizing not just the patient's symptoms, but the strain on family caregivers as well. The community's religious leaders came together to establish a network of support for elderly members of their congregations. They organized regular visits, helping to reduce the isolation that had contributed to the Wilson tragedy. At the care facility, Mrs. Wilson's room became a gathering place for other residents. Though she didn't always remember why she was there, she retained her warm personality, offering comfort to others even in her confusion. The staff often found her sharing stories about her roses with fellow residents, her face lighting up as she described their colors and fragrances. Spring approached slowly that year. In the Wilsons' garden, green shoots pushed through the soil, daffodils and tulips they had planted decades ago, preparing for another season of bloom. The yellow roses would follow, their buds a promise of renewal. The nephew had finally made peace with his decision to keep the house for now, turning it into a temporary residence for families visiting elderly relatives in care facilities. It seemed fitting that a home that had witnessed such love and tragedy could now offer comfort to others facing similar journeys. As the community moved forward, the lessons learned from that autumn morning remained. check on your neighbors, ask for help when needed. Recognize that independence, while precious, sometimes needs to be balanced with support and care. The Wilsons' story had changed their quiet suburb forever, creating ripples of awareness and compassion that continued to spread. In their tragedy, the community had found purpose, ensuring that other elderly couples wouldn't have to face their challenges alone. And in the care facility, Mrs. Wilson continued her journey, surrounded by people who understood her needs and supported her dignity. Though she couldn't remember the events that brought her there, she had found a new kind of peace, her days filled with gentle routines and caring faces. The yellow roses would bloom again, standing as a testament to love, loss, and the importance of communities coming together to care for their most vulnerable members.